Okay, hello everybody. Thank you for joining. We have just one person to be promoted. Okay, before starting, anybody has an announcement? Does anybody have an announcement? No, I think we are good. Okay, first first issue in our agenda is about the OpenJS Foundation Slack channel. It's already solved. Just to mention here, we are in the security Node.js dash security dash WG in the OpenJS Foundation Slack. So feel free to join. The next one is the issue 811. It's about the VM module. It's a discussion. Basically, we are building the threat model, and one of the issues raised there is that we have said that okay, VM module shouldn't be considered a security mechanism, but it's not clear for users either for security researchers why this can't be considered a vulnerability. For instance, in the documentation it says that it creates a new V8 context, so they might think that it might be used for, I don't know, avoid prototype pollution. We know that this is not the situation. It shouldn't be considered a mechanism, but we need to be more clear in that statement. So, an idea?
Well, an actual example of it not being helpful delivers the message. The question is, do we want to put examples of attacks in documentation?
Yeah, but I mean, once we say clearly in the documentation that you shouldn't run untrusted code on it, I think that we are good.
Isn't the documentation already saying something along these lines?
The documentation says that it shouldn't be considered a secret mechanism. So
okay,
there is
we could elaborate on that by saying it doesn't prevent prototype pollution. It doesn't provide enough isolation to avoid reaching the global context if someone wishes to do so. What it does is it gives a new context to a code that is not expecting to be in any wrappers. But if you know that you're going to run in VM, there's going to be ways to escape.
Okay, we can at least show an escape. I mean, I have seen in the issue. Let me see. Okay,
in the issue, there's an example of prototype pollution. That is
yes, but I have tried to run it locally, and it was working fine, at least in the 18 version.
But I think. Sorry, go ahead.
Okay, never mind. I'll just need to run it.
Okay. I think the fundamental thing is that there is no promise that this will help you, protect. If we go back to like some of the other discussions, our model is we trust running code. This is not intended to help you. The VM module has no promises to change that. It may be useful for testing and some other things, but you know, even if something works, there's no promise that that will continue to work or is intended to work to provide you some security protection. That's kind of, from my perspective, is the fundamental point on our front.
Okay, so you were suggesting just to say, okay, this is not, it was not created to with security on mind. The purpose of this feature is something else.
Yeah, like
maybe.
Go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, so maybe to add a bit to that, I think the wording on the threat document, on the threat model, is a bit confusing because it says the VM module aims to run code in a different V8 context. Therefore, it's not a security mechanism. I think that therefore there is kind of confusing because it doesn't really follow one from the other. So I would maybe remove the therefore and just say that the VM module is not a security mechanism, so don't use it for that.
Okay.
I think we updated the API docs to say that too.
Yes, we have. I pasted in the link here in the chat. There is a mention, Node VM is not a security mechanism. Don't use it to run untrusted code. So it should be enough. I just was looking for like an example, and I just saw that Ulysses added one of
yeah,
like
I just post one. I forgot to press the enter button, so I have the draft for a while. But yeah, actually, I found a very interesting article. If you refresh the issue, I just put a comment on that one. Let me also share it here. I found an article which
the issue.
Yeah, which also, you have a lot of code examples and a lot of explanations, which in general has two main ways. One is, commenting how to escape the sandbox in one hand. So I think it's visually very easy. I put also some snippets. All of them are working, at least in I think I am running 18 when I did the test. So it was nice to illustrate it. And also the problem on the DOS attack possibility, also that you have a different context, but you still to be in the same process. So if you put a while true or whatever, you have the option, to at the end also block resources. So yeah, I think this kind of, very visual and simple examples, of understanding why you should not use as a security mechanism, I think that's the approach. Aside of, improving the wording in terms of making it more easy, I think also, just putting some emphasis on, I don't know, DOS attack, escaping sandbox, these kind of things can happen. So I think provide a little bit more context to people, because I still think that VM is super abstract for so many people. So in general, has the feeling of it's not good to use it in terms of security because it's not built on that, but this is the reasons, so people can have a better, I think, understanding more than just saying no recommended. That was my.
I feel the same. Like normally it's totally okay to say, okay, don't use that for security reasons, but once we have this statement for a long period in the documentation, I think that would be great to explain why it shouldn't be used as a security mechanism, and it will be also useful for future developers, or if someone will wants to make it secure. So I think that's good. Thank you everybody for the suggestions. I will look to the recording and include it to the minutes. So just to summarize, remove the therefore in the statement, and also we can include these the both code examples that Ulysses added in the issue, and I think that we are good. What do you think?
I still suggest not adding specific examples, just to not have malicious code examples in the documentation as a principle.
Okay.
We could link to them, maybe, but preferably not popularizing the attack methods.
Yeah, so on that point, is the VM module a common module to use? Like, is it very, or is something very specific that not many people use?
I think that many people use libraries that use it, but not directly.
Okay, so maybe what I would say, since this is the section where we are saying what we trust and we don't trust, and what we don't trust, and we're saying, okay, we trust the code being run. So, okay, we say Node does not provide a sandbox, blah, blah, blah. And therefore Node does trust the code being run. And then on a separate paragraph, we make like a small note saying the VM module is not a security mechanism to allow you to run untrusted code. And then we can link to the examples explaining why. But just having it as a small note, apart from the main point, which is Node trusts the code being run.
Yeah, I think if anything, like in that VM, like in the API doc, once we have that documented somewhere that's like, here's what Node trusts, here's what it doesn't trust, pointing to that and say, basically, you know, Node trusts the code that's being run. The VM module does not change that in any way. So, you know, code can still do malicious things or something like that, and pointing over to that might be the way to go versus. It's sort of, I think it's along the lines of what you're saying, but instead of relying on it being in where we talk about the model, point to that model in the VM section to say, well, why is it still not, you know, why does it just make it clear it doesn't change that model.
Okay. So let me close the issue and comment all the suggestions will be applied in the threat model document. All the suggestions made in the working group meeting will be applied. Thanks, everybody. Okay, let's move to the next one then. Automatic check for dependencies and vulnerabilities in Node.js CI, Facundo.
Yeah, so news from the last time, I think it's Michael did the GitHub action for the script, so that's running. It's failing because there are some problems with the database. But that should be fixed by the new PR we have, which actually uses an API key from the database to query it. So then we're not rate limited anymore. And apart from that, yeah, I did some changes also to the GitHub action so that we don't have to provide it with like our own personal tokens to run. It just uses some tokens that GitHub Actions provides uniquely per run so that you can authenticate via that. And yeah, I think that's it. There's maybe one thing to discuss here where there's a new, so the script now reports there's an open vulnerability for a package named Undici, which it's actually already Node has already a fixed version of that dependency, so it's not vulnerable. But one of the places where we query for vulnerabilities hasn't yet uploaded the full information for that issue. So it says, okay, this dependency, this Undici program is vulnerable, but it doesn't say up to which version. And when the script sees that, it says, assumes all versions are vulnerable, therefore whatever Node has is also vulnerable. Maybe the discussion to be had here is, what do we do in those cases? Like, what do we do if from the vulnerabilities we get after querying, there's some that don't really specify a version range that is affected? One option would be to ignore those. We say, okay, these are incomplete reports, so we wait until they are actually complete before notifying the users. or actually creating the issue on the repo. But I don't know if that's actually safe to do. And the other way would be just to accept that there will be some false positives in these cases where the vulnerability is uploaded before the full information is available.
It will fix itself, right, at some point?
Yes.
Right. So my take is, like, one of the challenges we have is people come and ask about these. So, you know, if it's out there with that impartial information, people's scanners will report them. And part of what I think the value of this repo can be is like our place to tell people whether they still need to worry about them. So I don't think we should ignore them. I think we want to have the issue opened. And like in that case, like the one that says Indici CV 2022-3210, Mateo's like asserted, nope, doesn't apply to Node, so it's not an issue. And so I see this as our place that somebody comes and says, hey, there's some dependencies, there's some vulnerabilities in your dependencies. We'll say, well, go look in this repo. Maybe it already tells you what's going on. And hopefully we get to the point where they're all tagged like that and they can go and say, oh yeah, I can look at that one. That doesn't apply because, you know, the maintainers of Indici said it just doesn't apply. And eventually it'll drop off the list and we'll close that issue. So that's kind of like, that's where I would go, is like, yeah, it's fine to have it open. Yeah, there'll be some noise. We'll have to figure out how to like triage these. But having a place where we can communicate what our stance is, because we're going to get people getting those reports anyway if they're generated.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And also on that point, there's still the problem that when the script fails because there's a new vulnerability, it will create an issue every day, right? A new issue. There's no deduplication right now.
Yeah.
So we need to think of a way of, we need to think of a way of how do we want to handle this? Because in theory, we could check for open issues from the GitHub action and see, okay, what do we have open? But for that, we need some way to determine, okay, is this vulnerability already in one of the issues? Which is not really.
Sorry. I think that you can match
finished.
just the CVE. You change the issue to put the CVE on the top, so you can match it.
There could be multiple though in there.
Yes.
Nagdo has an idea, I think.
Yeah, so I posted a link to OpenJS Foundation package vulnerability collapse space, which we tried to start with some folks from NPM and Netflix and a few other people, but it didn't get off the ground. It was meant to address the issue of false positives in audits. And it's a much wider topic. Because there's a few categories of false positives, and there's different groups of people who would claim they're false positives or not. So one of the cases is someone reporting a vulnerability that doesn't really make sense for the threat model of the target, but that vulnerability exists and has a proof of concept, so it's being accepted and published. So the thing is, addressing those by claiming these are not affecting us is possible for a package or a target of this specific vulnerability, but then we have chains. So up the supply chain, how does anyone figure out who can be trusted and whose reports to follow? We're in a better position here because we are interested in just the dependencies of Node itself and our own claims, I'm assuming, on which things affect or not affect Node.js itself. So the idea of having an issue is really great. Just bear in mind that there's going to be multiple ways in which we can end up with a false positive, and this is a very wide problem that doesn't have an easy fix at this point, because someone's going to need to tell you that this is not actually a vulnerability, or it's a false positive for other reasons. So tracking that is going to need resources. I mean, human resources probably. Additionally, I can see one problem with creating issues with lookup. So if we don't want to duplicate issues, someone could create an adversarial issue with some bullshit claims in it before our script can detect something and create an issue where we can discuss, which means the actual issue popping up in one of our dependencies is going to be ignored.
That is a good point. I wondered if we basically want to limit who can create issues in this repo to the node collaborators. Although, like, one of my hopes is that like we can get NPM to assert for NPM and actually other groups. So maybe that's a separate thing. I think it's yeah, you're right. This is complex. The question is, can we do anything to avoid the issue every day?
So
how often do we think that's going to be the case, right?
So one of the options that I was thinking about is, let's say the script reports several vulnerabilities. We create one issue per each vulnerability, and then we put the code for the vulnerability in the name of the issue. Then on the next runs, the script, or the action rather, checks for existing issues that were opened by the GitHub bot, so that then we know that we're not actually victims of someone else spoofing issues.
Yeah.
And then if there is an issue open with the same vulnerability ID, we just don't open a new one. And maybe if there's an issue, a closed issue, we reopen it or something like that. But because it might be that the state of the vulnerability changes in time.
I like that, because like what you can see, if you look at the issues that are there, like that first one reported CV 2022-32210, and the issue that was opened, I changed it because there was only one. I changed that one issue to have the CVE name in it. And if there were multiples, then opening one per CVE is what I would have probably done. Like, and maybe reuse the existing one and created some duplicates.
I think that you can also, instead of like opening the issue like with all the CVs in the issue, you can just put labels. And I mean, other non-collaborators is not able to add labels to their issues. So when the script runs, it just check for the labels that matches. If there is a label, for instance, for the CVE1, and it exists in a GitHub issue, you don't need to create. But if there is no, for the CV2, there is no issue, you can create just for to the CV2 main.
But I think we want an issue for each one, because, and we're likely with the CV in the title, because the workflow I kind of see is somebody runs a scan against Node, there's CVs reported in the dependencies, they're like, hey, what's Node doing about that? They go to this repo, and ideally they find an issue that matches that CVE, and the discussion for each one of those is probably best in its own issue, because like one might be on Indici, one might be on NPM, and different people would be saying this does or doesn't apply. So I maybe even Facundo, building on what you're suggesting, is if we actually change the tool, so instead of generating one issue, it actually looked at the output and generated one per CVE reported. Is it always CVEs, or sometimes can we report things that don't have CVEs?
Yeah, so we also use the GitHub advisory database, and that has its own ID. Right. So it's either CVE or that, I think it's GHA.
So, but if we created one for each of those, whatever the ID we got, we created an issue and actually added that automatically to the title. And then on subsequent runs, it said, is there already an open issue for that? Yes. Okay, don't create one. No. okay, let's create one, or if it's like you said, closed, let's reopen it, because if it's being reported, obviously there's still some tools that would be reporting that it's an issue.
Yeah, I think that makes sense, and having it in the name makes them also more discoverable by people looking for them. And if there's a discussion or an argument about, okay, is this a false positive or does it actually apply to Node? It's better to have one discussion for one vulnerability in one issue and not having multiple discussions for multiple vulnerabilities in the same issue.
Yeah.
One last bit of experience from the package vuln curl space. We had cases, so we gathered a bit of historical cases on what's happening, and we had cases where someone found a vulnerability and the maintainer declined, as in said that this vulnerability is not really a problem, but there is no mechanism for feedback to vulnerability databases. If something becomes a vulnerability with a proof of concept and a CVE, it's really hard to get rid of it. So if we want a mechanism that reopens the issue after it's been closed because the vulnerability showed up again, be aware that there's vulnerabilities that going to potentially show up indefinitely. And we would need a mechanism to specifically ignore that or declare it's bogus.
So we have an ignore list. We have an ignore list on the script. That's the purpose of it, for like these vulnerabilities that are not really fixed, but are not a problem for Node,
Okay.
or they are not actually.
So now you've hit my pet peeve. What's the key on the ignore list?
The ID of the vulnerability.
So if we have a dependency that has a vulnerability with a certain ID, and we assert that this is not a problem for us, and then a different dependency contains the same vulnerability, we will also ignore that, even though we didn't have the opportunity to assess.
Well, I think vulnerabilities are tied to a software package, right?
No, not in my experience, at least.
Okay, so yeah, then that would be an issue.
And even if they were, the package can show up as a dependency of a dependency in different places in the dependency tree, some of which could affect the end product and some of which would not. This was the main premise of NPM Audit Resolver that I built some years ago, that it would key on not only the vulnerability ID, but also the location in the dependency tree.
Okay, so in this scenario, for example, if we wanted to ignore this new, let's say the Undici vulnerability, we would have to both specify the ID and that it's Undici, the package that it's affected.
And it's a direct dependency called Undici, or a nested dependency called Undici.
Yeah, I think that's.
Sorry, I need to pick something up. Sorry for a moment.
That may be more of an issue for, like in our case, yeah, I don't know how many dependencies like Undici has. NPM certainly has a bunch. I think that's worth thinking about. I don't think what we're doing will still be better than what we have today, which is we don't know about them at all, potentially. So
oh yeah, I think it's a good next step when we have something already working.
Yeah, just to mention,
it's a good point.
She has no dependency, production dependencies, just dev dependencies. That's totally fine.
Right. So I think there's a few like NPM that have a bunch of they have obviously a bunch of dependencies, and we may have to learn how those get reported up through, right? Like, will that show, you know, when we ask the database, is it going to tell us that NPM is vulnerable, or is it going to tell us that NPM is vulnerable because of some dependency lower down? Or
so what we actually query is for vulnerabilities for a specific package. So we would say, okay, give me all the vulnerabilities for NPM, and then we would get a list of those.
right.
And then what I would say is the ignoring mechanism would have to be at the level of each query. So for example, if we are querying for NPM vulnerabilities, and there is an ID with NPM on the ignore list, we apply the ignore list on that query only. But if packages further down the line have the same vulnerability, the query doesn't apply that blacklist because it's not called NPM, the package.
Right, we can at least do that. And I think the next level might be, okay, NPM has vulnerability in one of its dependencies has the issue, but then later a different dependency uses the same thing because things change over time.
I might have an example that's gonna be that's gonna make it easier to reason about. I think everyone's favorite regular expression denial of service. If it shows up, we want to ignore it. It's often reported in bulk. So that's an additional argument. But even if it's reported against a single package, if we use it in our dependencies for something that's not possible to use in a way that would hurt us, we will decide to ignore it. But then if it shows up in a different place that happens to be somewhere on the path of handling an HTTP request, then we definitely want to look into it again. And that's my example of like having the same package with the same vulnerability that we already rightfully ignored show up elsewhere in a way that we want to look at it again.
I think maybe opening an issue to discuss how we handle that would be good. While you were out, my comment was what we're doing here is still better than what we were doing before, which is basically finding out when people pointed them out to us.
Yeah.
So even if we exclude a few that we shouldn't have, we're still doing better. So I wouldn't stop, or we should continue the work we're doing, but that's something to have an issue sort of async to say, okay, how can we make sure we're doing the best possible thing there?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Maybe a brute force way of doing it that I'm thinking of right now is the databases have a field which says, okay, when was this vulnerability last updated? So what we could do is, if there is a vulnerability in the ignore list, and then we store the date in which it was ignored, let's say, then we say, okay, if we're ignoring a vulnerability, but the last updated time is after we ignored it, we open the issue again. And then you will have more false positives, but you won't miss any changes on those CVEs.
Yeah, I think we'd have to understand what happens when the different situations, like how do they get reported up through the database in those situations to see if that helps.
Yeah. I think that we need to list all the issues in the issue, and then we start discussing there, because I don't think that we'll come up with a good solution in just 20 minutes. I think that we can move on to the next issue, and but please, Facundo, if you can list the potential issues that we can keep going in the next meeting.
Yeah, I think separately a good, if a good step would be to have the action create those individual CVEs and like you were suggesting, like reopen or not create them. If that's possible, that would be definitely a good addition.
Okay, so moving forward to the threat model, issue 799. I will share also the document here for those who don't have. Let me open it here. Here we go. Just sent in the chat. As usual, we go directly to the agenda and we start discussing top to bottom. And the first item is are potential mitigations and mitigations different? This one is like from the past, but we are waiting for Michael to address that. Basically, we are wondering if a potential mitigation section is totally different from mitigations, because I mean, we see as a potential mitigations flags such as frozen intrinsics or policy that is not stable yet, but we still think that this is a mitigation. So our suggestion is just to maybe we need just remove explore potential mitigations and just put everything in the threat mitigations.
Yeah, my thought is they're the same, like just say mitigations, and because anything's a potential one until you actually apply it, right?
Yeah, but once we have it in mitigations, we will receive more feedback from security research or even end users telling, okay, this is not working as expected. Not as expected. I mean, the policy has a lack of this feature or something else, and then we can work on that. If we add it to potential mitigations, I don't think that any user will use it in the end of the day.
Yeah, I think, well, I guess I was like, yeah, just having one section, which is like, here's the mitigations that we know exist, although we have to be very clear that, again,
stable,
like, for example, the security policies, we're not promising those actually change our security model, right? Until we're comfortable that we're going to like consider security vulnerabilities and things that are broken there. It's like, we just have to make sure we like, here's some stuff that exists, but I don't know, that's where it gets tricky. Like, until we're actually willing as a project to say this is something, you know, I don't know quite what we're saying. We can point to external, you know, like say like Docker, because even that case, right? Like we'd say, hey, you can use Docker to give yourself isolation in this situation, but it's like, that's not something we're giving any promises about, right?
Yeah, maybe it makes sense to leave it for the other document, the one we discussed about best practices for safety and security.
Yeah,
as a part from the threat model.
Yeah, actually, I see the question here is like, should we actually, for instance, policy is just is not stable yet. It's like experimental, as far I remember. Should we list it as a mitigation, or since it's not stable yet, we don't need to mention or let it to the second document? I think this is the main question here, you know, like, show, for instance, for this specific threat, we know that policy might be a resolution, a mitigation, but we are not sure if we should mention it as a mitigation because it's not stable yet.
Explicitly highlighting the fact that it's experimental should be enough of a deterrent if someone wants to bet their life on it.
Yeah, so for that reason, I believe the explore potential mitigation section should still exist. So then we can correlate like potential mitigations is not necessarily a mitigation, but might work.
I guess I would put them all as potential.
Sorry? Yeah, so the thing with mitigations is that mitigations are, by the meaning of the word, already not something sufficient to solve all your issues. It's not like a solution, it's a mitigation. So it makes the problem either less severe or less likely. So I think to make the distinction between potential and mitigation, to me, they are the same thing. All mitigations are potential. You can list one mitigation and it will help things, but people, an attacker can still get around it, right?
And almost having them in a separate doc would make some sense to me. Like if you have a clear doc, like one which is basically clearly states, here's what Node gives you. And then maybe, you know, even with the threats, we could say, so it doesn't protect you from this, doesn't protect you from this, doesn't protect you from this. Then in a separate doc that says, okay, well, here's some mitigations that will help you say for this threat, here's what you could do. You could use Docker. 2, you could use this other thing. I don't know if that makes sense.
I see. So your suggestion is just for the threat model does not list any mitigation, just list the threats and what Node.js secure and what those Node.js does not trust. At least you can do it by yourself.
I think that would be clearer then, because as soon as we start to talk about the other things, it's going to get bigger and more complex. And so having like something shorter and just to that point would be useful to say, here's you're reporting a vulnerability, here's our opinion, basically, right? And then separately, oh, but here's best practices or whatever in terms of like, how do you handle, you're running in a container. Well, actually that addresses a number of these things, because like, hey, the container isolates the file system. So the fact that we trust the file system from the rest of the machine probably is okay or not, right? Or you're running locally. Well, this is still an issue, so be aware. Or
to make a counterpoint to that, I kind of liked having the mitigations right next to the threats. At least like a short version, right? It's like, okay, use this and check check the docs at this link. Because then you can see, okay, this is a threat. And for some, let's say someone is reading the threat model to see if what they discovered is actually a vulnerability. They can see, oh, it's actually a problem, but there are mitigations, and these are those. And they don't have to go to a different document and look for, okay, which are the possible mitigations for the problem I discovered. So I think a separate document, like with a more detailed description of mitigations, is fine, but I would still leave like a short list of short descriptions of what you could do for each threat.
How about the link to a specific part of that document with mitigations?
Yeah, I would say the same. Like in the here we have the threats and we have the mitigation, and the mitigation to the same a link to the same document, but it's just pointing to the second one, no?
So we discussed this the last meeting, and my point there was that for mitigations that are valid for multiple threats, let's say, okay, use a Docker container. Sure, let's make a separate section, put it there, and then link to that part of the document. But there are certain mitigations, like, okay, use this flag when creating an HTTP server, which is maybe only useful for one threat. I would say, let's not put it on a separate part of the document. Let's just list it on the thread itself as part of the mitigations.
yeah, and part of maybe what I'm thinking is like, if we have the security model or the part that says, here's what Node's model is, and then a separate doc which talks about, okay, what are the threats and what's the implication of the Node security model in that context, right? Like a threat is, somebody on your local file system. And then you can say, well, in the context of Node, well, we trust everything on the local file system. So Node itself doesn't provide anything. Here are some external mitigations that you might apply, right?
Okay, yeah, actually, it's still up in there, the resolution for that, because we have 2 counterpoints, and those seems valid to me, honestly. But I do believe that even being just, for instance, as Facundo mentioned, this mitigation is specific for this CV, for this threat, I still would mention it in a separate document, because it can be specific for this issue right now, but in a near future it can solve other vulnerability as well. So I don't see, honestly, I don't see any problem in moving it to a separate document. But since this document is still small, I don't think that we need to do it right now. We can do it like when the document is almost finished.
Yeah, I'd agree. Once we have the content, then we can understand how to best organize. So I wouldn't worry about that too much right now.
Yeah, I think that we can still keep going with only in this document with all the threat mitigations here. And I would remove the explore potential mitigation section. And also, for instance, if a mitigation for a specific threat is to use a experimental feature, we need to mention in that mitigation, okay, this is experimental, so you need to be aware of it. So I think that's a good solution.
Any chance we could go to 6?
Yes, let's go.
Okay, because I might not make the next one, so I just wanted to introduce that one if we can.
Yeah, the VM one was already solved, so remove it.
So I just spent a little bit of time writing up. If you go to maybe here, I'll share to in the chat. No, not in the chat. Share. Where's the screen share? There we go. Okay. Like I spent a little bit of time just writing like a very short, something that might be like the first, here's what we trust and what we don't trust, and how that applies to vulnerabilities. And I don't know if, probably not the right words yet, but it's basically like the things that I could see that we believe will be a vulnerability is like, if you can cause either, let's see. So if you can affect things that we do trust and cause loss of, integrity, confidentiality, or data protected through the correct use of the Node APIs, or the availability of the runtime itself, like in a severe way, that's something we consider a vulnerability. But if you control one of the things we don't trust, that never ends up being a vulnerability, right? So, and the things we trust are like the operating system, any code that we're asked to run, any inputs we're given. So for example, if an application accepts an input from a user and passes it to one of those APIs, we would consider that trusted. Like it's up to the application to make sure that that's a trusted value. And so we wouldn't consider that resulting in any vulnerability. The things that we do not trust are things like the other ends of HTTP and HTTP2 connections. So if we're making a connect, if we help the user set up an HTTP request, and by sending something back to that HTTP server, for example, that Node controls, by adding extra headers or whatever, and that could cause us to crash, then we would consider that a vulnerability. Or if we do something where like certificate checks can be bypassed, that would be. I think that might apply to like, if we're making DNS calls on behalf of the end user, right? And if somebody could do a denial of service because we're talking to an external DNS server. And then the other one is like, if people are using data that we've protected through our APIs, so if you use the crypto APIs, like we don't trust those consumers. So if there's some way you could bypass the protection that if you're asking us to encrypt something and somehow you can bypass that, that's a vulnerability. The thing I just sort of want to introduce here though is that actually that definition would result in some of the vulnerabilities we have said are vulnerabilities not actually being vulnerabilities. So for example, the prototype pollution attacks, we would actually, I don't think that would fall under that description, because we would say, no, it's not our fault. It's up to the user to sanitize data that comes to us. But I think coming to something simple like that, like this, the closer we can come to this very simple definition to gauge our vulnerabilities, the better. Because right now, I think there's a number of them are sort of ad hoc. It's like, oh yeah, we think that's serious or important. We assign it, we say it's a vulnerability, but it's, there's some that I think we could say fall into some of this definition that would be, and others that aren't in what we currently do. So if we could actually get something that we agreed on, I don't think that the thing I tried to do in the last paragraph is I don't think that means we wouldn't issue CVEs or fix things that we think are important. It's just that we wouldn't necessarily call them a vulnerability. Like the prototype pollution ones, we may still want to fix those in our APIs because our goal would be to make sure we don't have APIs that are easy to do the wrong thing with. But we could say they're not a vulnerability because you made a mistake when you used the API, right? And we're going to fix it because we want to make that harder to do. But fundamentally, it's not a vulnerability in the APIs. And that would address how we would report them and, that kind of stuff. So I don't think anybody, we're going to come to a conclusion on that. But my goal is to see if we could get to some very short description. And then based on that, you would then say, well, okay, for each of the threats, does that mean Node protects you against that threat or not, right? And you could test it and say, oh, well, the threat is CWE, third-party malicious modules. Nope, all code that's given to us to run is trusted. So anything that falls into that CWE is not a vulnerability in Node.
Okay.
And even like this uncontrolled search path element, again, if we've said we trust the file system, then again, we'd say, no, that's not a vulnerability.
Basically, these the first statement on the top is you replace the 4 sections that we have, like Node.js do not trust HTTP or do not trust in the file system or something like that, right? So this
I pulled stuff from what we had above, trying to just come to the very, the most concise I could get down to. What does that mean in terms of like, when will we say something is a vulnerability and when will it not?
Yeah, okay. And also this is a suggestion, a good suggestion at least. So it means that we can just remove the environment. We don't actually, in the previous meeting, we were thinking that maybe all the threats that we are willing to solve in this working group is basically referred to the local system, so we can remove the environment also. And I honestly, I like it. I think that we can use it.
Because I think like the environment, I think when you get into the threats, you could then say each environment has different threats or something like that. So I think that's a place where you can still factor that in. But fundamentally, like as Node, we don't care where you're running. We give you the same promise.
Yes. So like it's up to you as engineer or as a developer to understand which environment you are in, which threat applies to you.
Right. And we can provide some guidance and stuff, but like the fundamental short of, hey, when you report something to us, do we think it's a vulnerability or not? Now, the challenge I have is like, there are a bunch which we've said, yeah, that's a vulnerability. And I know we'd still want to fix them. Like the recent Windows one, I think if you put that against this, we would say, sorry, that's not a vulnerability because we trust the file system. Okay. So I think we want to work through some of those and make sure we're comfortable, or if we really think that should be, how would we tweak that so that it would be covered by?
Just a quick question. Honestly, I don't see it totally different what we have today, because in that document we have what Node.js trust and not trust, and then we have the threats. Is you are just suggesting a different design? Is this?
A little bit, and like, but also I'm not sure we've said if it's that we will, like, this basically could be something we would put somewhere in Node that says, if you're reporting a vulnerability, here's our statement. We trust it. And yeah, like it's that like this could stand on its own somewhere to say, here is your reporting, I don't know what we call it, security model, whatever, but like just this by itself could be our entry point that says, if you're trying to decide whether you think this is a vulnerability, here's the guidance we're giving you. And then the discussion of the threat models and all that is really useful, but that would be like a follow-on interpreting this to help people interpret what it means to you as a developer, for example, like, hey, I'm running locally. The threat is, people who are on my shared system. Reading this, that means, nope, Node doesn't protect you against that. So what are the other mitigations that you might want to take into consideration?
Okay, that makes sense to me. I will try to include it to the document, like from the top to bottom, and then we keep going. And about the mitigations, we can still keep in this document, but I think that in the near future we can move it to somewhere else. So,
yeah, and I'm like,
I think that's very clear. Actually, this is better.
If we could get this group to agree, we think this is that, like something along that short section is good, then I think we should get like TSC and broader input, because I could see this piece could be PR'd into somewhere in the project without all the other stuff being done.
Yeah, absolutely. What do you guys think?
I really like the TLDR approach, like a short version, clear, straightforward. And if you are not clear on this, the interpretation are after. So for me, makes a lot of sense. And I think it's easier, for people who has a lot of experience reporting books and things like that. It's like basic rules. So I think it's clear. And people who need more context can read deeper, and spend more time. But for a basic, should I apply for this, yes or no? I think for most of people, will solve the problem.
Yep, I think it makes a lot of sense. I have one quick question before you go on the on the first item of what Node does not trust, which is related to another item on the agenda. It says that Node does not trust data received through HTTP. But I remember seeing on the documentation that we actually, when we receive a request through HTTP, we divide it into headers and body, and we actually don't do anything, but any validation on the body. So we kind of trust the body, right?
That would be a perfect extension to say, the header data, or limit that down to, we trust the header data, but we don't trust the body data, and just pass that on unchanged.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. That makes total sense to get that in there for sure. Okay, I do have to drop because I have another meeting. But thanks for putting that earlier on the agenda.
Yeah, thank you, Michael.